Okay, so yeah, thanks to Steph for the funding. But it was important that the funding's come from Manchester City, but it was important that this was not a football club doing football club research. It had to have academic rigour and tackle areas that the club itself may not want highlighting. We had no idea whether some of the interviewees would be critical of the club or whether information would come forward providing negative views of the club, but what we did know was that we wanted to get the truth. We wanted to capture the stories, feelings and emotions of all the players. We did not want anything hidden. For me, oral history was the right approach. I've been performing interviews and capturing stories like this for decades. That's Olympic gold medalist Anne Packer and her husband, silver medalist Robbie Brightwell. That's an interview I did years ago. I love the way oral history brings out feelings, emotions, adds colour to the facts. And I've spent many, many hours over the years capturing material in this manner on various projects and for several books. Alongside the interviews, we also aim to capture memorabilia and images, as Steph said. This was her main aim. She had to build the collection, and whilst the sound art recordings will be preserved and will be there for future generations with the transcriptions and so on, the visual aspects could also be used to actually encourage people to actually dive into the stories. I'm sure most of you know the advantages and disadvantages of oral history, so I'm not going to go through all these points here now. But I think the key thing for me is that it actually gives voice to marginalised groups, or people whose history has not been written, or people who didn't write history. I mean, quite often we all know whether it's for research on sport or politics or whatever it may be, the winners often write the history. It's often men of a certain age and class and so on. So it was important to try and use oral history to actually try and tease out the right stories and try and get the information that actually told us what it was actually like to play, what it was like to be there, what it was like to be there at the formation. Recognised, of course, that there are weaknesses. People get older, people are forgetful, people are selective with their memories. We know all that. Fortunately, most of our players are of an age where, you know, some of these issues haven't actually affected them. Our oldest player that we've managed to track down is in her 60s. And so, yeah, those sort of issues are not there. But, you know, I was at the first game. There are a million different stories from that first game. So we know that we do need to look through this. So triangulation is important. Also important to try and make sure that we compare to some of the other evidence, the match reports, the meeting minutes, or whatever we can find. And of course, there was one big issue. I'm a man. I was told, mostly by men, that it would be inappropriate for me to do this project at one point, which is ridiculous because I can't play football either, so you know I shouldn't be anywhere near a football pitch. Anyway, there's a couple of quotes about oral history which you can read there. I won't go through them, but it is worth stating that I love oral history because it brings out so many interesting angles and stories. Personally, I fell in love with this approach back in about 2000. I found a woman who was well into her 80s, stood outside the old Main Road Stadium at Manchester City. And she was just looking at the stadium. She went, "Hey, I was here the day it opened in 1923. So I quickly got my cassette recorder out of the car, took her into the stadium, and we started to talk. And she infused me so much about the sights, the sounds, the memories, the feelings that she had as a 6-year-old girl when she walked into that stadium in August 1923. And that football moment stayed with her throughout her life. Nobody else cared, particularly in that area. Nobody would have cared. But it brought home to me the importance of what we do and the importance of actually capturing this material. Of course, we can criticise oral history because it is subjective, interpretation is one thing, but let's face it, everything that appears in the newspapers has been judged by somebody to appear. It's an angle, you know, so oral history, I think, is, in this case, the absolute perfect way to capture material. So what about the process itself? We had to contact players, coaches, whoever we could. We put out appeals. We used our own networks, my networks, Steph's networks, Manchester City's, friends of friends of friends, and slowly we started to build up a bit of a database. We placed adverts in the City Match programme, and we still do that because we're keen to hear from anyone. And if it's an ex-Manchester City women player, a ladies player, women player, whichever area you played here today, then please grab one of us and we'll be keen to start an interview. We also talked to the Manchester City Women's Supporters Club, and we had a special evening where they interviewed me about the project, and that actually teased out some good stories as well. So, you know, we've tried to really promote the project and try to get people to understand what it's about. It's worth saying this is funded entirely by a football club, as I mentioned earlier. It's not received lottery bids, it's not received anything else. The idea was that we wanted to prove this project and get it out there, but the academic rigour is making sure that it tells the right story, or the truthful story. Okay. So we've compiled a database of players. There's still a lot to be done on that. The club's archives, as you heard, were pretty non-existent. That still needs to be developed. We decided to interview a minimum of 15 players, which doesn't sound a lot, but our reasoning was that there were about 5 key areas in the club's history, and those getting at least 3 players from each area would give us the full story. We are going to interview more than that. The project officially ends later this year, but it's one of these projects that I think will stick with some of us for the rest of our lives. There will always be more Manchester City women players. There'll always be more stories. The interviews. We decided that it was important, even though I'm an academic and I've been doing this, you know, writing for 30 years, researching for 30 years, interviewing people for 30 years, we feel it's important to keep challenging ourselves. Training was extremely useful. So we got training from the Oral History Society to make sure we were key, you know, up to date with topics, up to date with subjects, up to date with how to get the right stories out there. A bit of focus on how to do interviews that are looking purely at a female-based sport or activity. And this training was extremely useful and reminded us of some of the techniques, procedures and approaches that could help. Gavin Michael, the man responsible for the club's entry into the Women's Super League, was one of the people that we interviewed first, as I said. He told us an awful lot about that process, which we may not publish in an official club publication, but it will certainly make its way to an academic publication because it tells us a lot about the way the game was structured and the way a club had to put together an application like that. The collection has obviously improved with scrapbooks arriving and so on. It is fair to say that some interviewees have been reluctant. They were worried that the football club was after something. They were worried that they had nothing to say, that they were an irrelevance because at the time of the launch, the history of the club seemed to be irrelevant as far as the media were concerned. But we've managed to reassure most of those, not all, we've reassured most of them. And what's tended to happen as the interviews have gone on, somebody else then has come forward through a connection and a link like that. So it's started to improve and develop. We still have a long way to go. Some of the interviewees were interviewed in the actual dressing room now used by the women's team, which Beverton Stadium. If you can imagine, I'm sure many of you know, when you first start playing football, you're on a park pitch, freezing conditions, no boiler, you've got no hot water, it's a miserable existence, and then you go into the current Manchester City women's dressing room, which is incredible in comparison. So that was a bit of a highlight. Some of the sessions have been like therapy sessions for some of the players, but you know, some great stories coming out. But all the interviewees are, almost without exception, proud of their time at the club. Now, this isn't proud of success necessarily. Sometimes it's proud that they kept it going, that they managed to survive despite the pressures. And they also care about the development of the club moving forward. I can't reiterate enough how upset some of them were at the way the relaunch by the coverage in the media was that this club had never existed. Just to give a bit of perspective, they were formed around the same time as Arsenal, played at the same time as Arsenal in those formative years. The Women's FA, which used to be based at the Corn Exchange just across the road, were very supportive and actually published material on them being a groundbreaking men's club that's moved into the women's game. They played in the highest level they could play in, and so on and so on. You know, they entered the Women's FA Cup in the first full season. So they were disappointed at that, and I can't reiterate that enough. There was also negativity about Manchester City's support at times. Kit was a big issue, football kit. Initially, they wore the kit that the men's team had worn. And this sometimes happened that on the Saturday, the men's team would play Sheffield United in a league game, and 2 days later, or 3 days later, that kit, cleaned, would appear in the women's dressing room, and they would wear that same kit. First game, some of the photographs from the very first game show how inappropriate that kit was. It just wasn't appropriate. Other times, the kit was handed down from the youth team, or it was purchased through a community initiative, or the women themselves paid for it. Facts emerging from the project was perceived as a pioneering club, as we said. It was established by a guy called Neil Mather, who's actually on that picture. It was an official club. It's never been an unofficial club. It was always an official club. But it was a community initiative, and I think that still upsets people today, that women's football is not a community initiative, and there are still many major men's teams that see it as a community initiative. Most of those early women had come from teams like Leeso, Manchester United, who had a team at the time, Woodley, which had traced its roots back to Manchester Corinthians, Blue Star and Lady Blues and so on. So they were known in the North West Regional League system. Family support crucial. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move on quickly. But as you can see from the points, there are some big achievements in those early days. Where it went wrong was in the 1990s. Manchester City's men's team almost went out of business. It dropped to its lowest ever point, 97, 98, 99. The women's team did not get quite the support it should have done. And then throughout the 2000s, the team tried to get back on track. And by about 2002, the women's team was receiving some support from the club and growing. Throughout its history, it had always maintained multiple teams, and it had acted like a major side as far as it could. We aim to finish the project of the interviews by June. There's lots more work to go on. We're aiming for a reunion event in November, which will be the 30th anniversary, which is very important. We're going to produce a book or a booklet of some sort, and there will be some academic papers that talk about some of the issues that have come out of the work. There's an awful lot of talk about cliques within the game, about the role of male coaches, female coaches, which are very interesting and developing. So, this project is already able to establish a better understanding of that team within the football club and within the local area and within the current playing squad, some of whom are quite interested in the way the project's going. We want ultimately to get the record of every player who played for that team. It's a long way to go. No records were kept. We needed Steph all those years ago. It just was a nightmare. But we aim to do that. And for me, there's a few facts. One of the most interesting aspects that's come out of it really is we keep being surprised. And one of our biggest surprises was that one of the women, Gail Redstone, is now a 60-odd-year-old grandmother and is still playing competitively every week. She's training with her grandchildren, and she was talked back into it a few weeks ago. She still holds out hope that one day Steph Houghton's going to get injured and she might make it into the City women's team, but she's still playing. So she's quite an inspirational figure. That's been a very brief run-through of the project. We are at the International Football History Conference, which I've organised, which is taking place in June. Steph will be having a display of some of the objects, images that have come out of the project, and obviously we aim to do some more information about the project then. But thanks for your time, and hope we've all gained something. Thank you.